In the first part of the video for this module 5, we learned about the background behind the Norman conquest and the changes in the English language thereafter, which is how Old English changed to Middle English. In this video, I am going to talk to you about the origin of Normandy, the background of the Battle of Hastings in the year 1066, and the settlement of the Normans in England. On the northern coast of France, directly across from England, is a district extending some 75 miles back from the Channel and known as Normandy. It derives its name from the bands of Northmen who settled there in the 9th and 10th centuries, at the same time that similar bands were settling in the north and east of England. The Seine offered a convenient channel for penetration into the country, and the settlements of Danes in the region furnished a close parallel to those around the Humber. A generation after Alfred reached an agreement with the Northmen in England, a somewhat similar understanding was reached between Rollo, the leader of the Danes in Normandy, and Charles the Simple, King of France. In the year 912, the right of the Northmen to occupy this part of France was recognized. Rollo acknowledged the French king as his overlord and became the first Duke of the Normans. In the following century and a half, a succession of masterful dukes raised the dukedom to a position of great influence, overshadowing at times the power of the King of France. The adaptability of the Scandinavian, always a marked characteristic of the people, nowhere showed itself more quickly, readily adopting the ideas and customs of those among whom they came to live. The Normans had soon absorbed the most important elements of French civilization. Moreover, they injected fresh vigor into what they borrowed. They profited from their contact with French military forces and, adding French tactics to their own impetuous courage, soon had one of the best armies in Europe. They took important features of Frankish law, including the idea of the jury, and with a genius for organization that shows up as clearly in the Norman kingdom of Sicily as in Normandy and later in England, made it one of the outstanding legal systems of the world. They accepted Christianity and began the construction of those great Norman cathedrals that are still marvels to the modern architect. But most important of all, they soon gave up their own language and learned French. So rapidly did the old Scandinavian tongue disappear in the Norman capital that the second duke was forced to send his son to Berwick's so that he might learn something of the speech of his forefathers. In the 11th century, at the time of Norman conquest, the civilization of Normandy was essentially French, and the Normans were among the most advanced and progressive of the peoples of Europe. For some years before the Norman conquest, the relations between England and Normandy had been fairly close. In 1002, Ethelred the Unready had married a Norman wife and, when driven into exile by the Danes, took refuge with his brother-in-law, the Duke of Normandy. His son, Edward, who had thus been brought up in France, was almost more French than English. In 1042, the Danish line died out, and Edward, known as the Confessor, was restored to the throne from which his father had been driven. He brought with him a number of his Norman friends, enriched them, and gave them important places in the government. A strong French atmosphere pervaded the English court during the 24 years of his reign. Now, let's talk about the year 1066 1066, the Battle of Hastings, the famous battle that changed the politics and the geography of England forever. In January 1066, after a reign of 24 years, Edward the Confessor died childless. England was again faced with the choice of a successor, and there was not much doubt as to where the choice would fall. At his succession, Edward had found England divided into a few large districts, each under the control of a powerful earl. The most influential of these nobles was Godwin, Earl of the West Saxon earldom. He was a shrewd, capable man and was soon Edward's principal adviser. Except for one brief interval, he was the virtual ruler of England until the time of his death. His eldest son, Harold, succeeded to his title and influence, and during the last 12 years of Edward's reign, exercised a firm and capable influence over national affairs. The day after Edward's death, Harold was elected king. However, this election did not long go unchallenged. William, the Duke of Normandy at this time, was a second cousin to the late king. Although this relationship did not give him any right of inheritance to the English throne, he had nevertheless been living in expectation of becoming Edward's successor. Actually, Edward seems to have encouraged him in this hope. While William had been on a brief visit in England, Edward had assured him that he would succeed him. Even Harold had been led to acknowledge his claim. Having on one occasion fallen into William's hands, it seems he had been forced to swear, as the price of his freedom, not to become a candidate or oppose William's election. But the English had enough of French favorites, and when the time came, Harold did not consider himself bound by his former pledge. Now, only by force William could hope to obtain his crown. Perhaps the difficulty involved in an armed invasion of England would have discouraged a less determined claimant. But William was an exceptionally able man. From infancy, he had surmounted difficulties. Handicapped by the taint of illegitimacy, the son of his father by a tanner's daughter of Felice, he had succeeded to the dukedom of Normandy at the age of 6. He was the object of repeated attempts upon his life, and only the devoted care of his regents enabled him to reach maturity. In early manhood, he was made to face a number of crucial contests with rebellious barons, powerful neighbors, and even the French king. But he had emerged triumphantly from them all, greatly strengthened in position and admirably schooled for the final test of his fortune. William the Great, as the chroniclers called him, was not the man to relinquish a kingdom without a struggle. He came to terms with his rivals and enemies on the continent. He appealed to the Pope for the sanction of his enterprise and received the blessing of the Church. As a result of these inducements, the ambitious, the adventurous, and the greedy flocked to his banner from all over France and even other parts of Europe. In September, he landed at Pevensey on the south coast of England with a formidable force. His landing was unopposed. Harold was occupied in the north of England, meeting an invasion by the King of Norway. Hardly had Harold triumphed in battle over the invaders when the word reached him of William's landing. The news was scarcely unexpected, but the English were not fully prepared for it. It was difficult to keep a medieval army together over a protracted period. William's departure had been delayed, and with the coming of the harvest season, many of those whom Harold had assembled a few months before in anticipation of an attack had been sent home. Now, Harold was forced to meet the invader with such forces as he had. He called upon his brothers in law in the earldoms of Mercia and Northumbria to join him and repel the foreigner by a united effort. But they hung back. Nevertheless, hurrying south with his army, Harold finally reached a point between the Norman host and London. He drew up his forces on a broad hill at Senlac, not far from Hastings, and awaited William's attack. The battle began at about 9 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, so advantageous was Harold's position, and so well did the English defend themselves, that in the afternoon they still held their ground. For William, the situation was becoming desperate, and he resorted to a desperate stratagem. His only hope lay in getting the English out of their advantageous position on the hill. Because he could not drive them off, he determined to try to lure them off and ordered a feigned retreat. The English fell into the trap. Thinking the Normans were really fleeing, a part of the English army started in pursuit, intending to cut them down in their flight. But the Normans made a stand, and the battle was renewed on more even terms. Then the disaster on the English army happened. Harold was killed during the battle. According to tradition, he was pierced in the eye by a Norman arrow, although the Bayeux tapestry supplies contradictory evidence about the arrow. In any event, his death seems to have been instantaneous. Two of his brothers had already fallen. Deprived of their leaders, the English became disorganized. The confusion spread. The Normans were quick to profit by the situation, and the English were soon in full retreat. When the night fell, they were fleeing in all directions, seeking safety under the cover of the darkness, and William was left in possession of the field. This was the Battle of Hastings, the famous battle of 1066. Although William had won the Battle of Hastings and eliminated his rival, he had not yet attained the English crown. It was only after he had burned and pillaged the southeast of England that the citizens of London decided that further resistance would be useless. Accordingly, they capitulated, and on a Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned the King of England. This victory of the Normans over English is regarded to be a turning point in the history of England, and this sets the scene for the beginning of the Middle English, or the change of Old English into Middle English. Now let's talk about the Norman settlement. William's victory at Hastings and his subsequent coronation in London involved more than a mere substitution of one monarch for another. It was not as though he had been chosen originally as the successor of Edward. In that case, there would doubtless have been more French favorites at court, as in the time of the Confessor, and Normans in certain important offices, but the English nobility would have remained intact, and the English government would have continued with its tradition unbroken. But William's possession of the throne had been a matter of conquest and was attended by all the consequences of the conquest of one people by another. One of the most important of these consequences was the introduction of a new nobility. Many of the English higher class had been killed on the field at Hastings. Those who escaped were treated as traitors, and the places of both alike were filled by William's Norman followers. This process was repeated several times during the next 4 years while the conquest was being completed. William's coronation did not win immediate recognition throughout England. He was, in fact, acknowledged only in the southeast. Upon his return from a visit to Normandy the following year, he was faced with serious rebellions in the southwest, the west, and the north. It was necessary for him to enter upon a series of campaigns and to demonstrate, often with ruthless severity, his mastery of the country. As a result of these campaigns, the old English nobility was practically wiped out. What
In
was true in the
1072,
time of the
only one of the
conqueror
12
was
earls in
true
England
also in the
was
reigns
an
of his
Englishman,
sons, and later.
and he was
For
executed
several
4 years later.
generations after the conquest, the important positions and the great estates were almost always held by Normans or men of foreign blood. In like manner, Norman prelates were gradually introduced into all important positions in the church. The two archbishops were Normans. Wulfstan of Worcester was the only Old English bishop who retained his office until the end of the Conqueror's reign, and even his exceptional personality did not prevent him from being scorned by Lanfranc as a simple and untutored man, ignorant of the French language and unable to assist in the king's councils. The English abbots were replaced more slowly, but as fast as vacancies occurred through death or deprivation of, they were filled generally by foreigners. In 1075, 13 of the 21 abbots who signed the decrees of the Council of London were English. 12 years later, their number had been reduced to three. Foreign monks and priests followed the example of their superiors and sought the greater opportunities for advancement that England now offered. A number of new foundations were established and entirely peopled by monks brought over from Norman houses. It is less easy to speak with certainty of the Normans in the lower walks of life who came into England with William's army. Many of them doubtless remained in the island, and their number was increased by constant accretions throughout the rest of the 11th century and the whole of the next. The numerous castles that the conqueror built were apparently garrisoned by foreign troops. So, This was the political angle of the Battle of Hastings and the consequences and the settlement after that. And we already said that this is the most remarkable turning point in the history of the English language because this is when Old English changes to Middle English because of the influence of the French language.